All right, we've got April 27th, 2025. This is my review of reading, let's see, 2 Samuel chapter 12, the end of chapter 12, basically. We do see a repeat of that in Chronicles 22 through 3. Then we've got Samuel 13, looks like 13 and 14. Looks like that's what we have, 13 and 14. Well, that's going to be a little easier to write, but first of all, we've got, this is a really cool little thing right in the very beginning about Joab. Joab's fighting and he's ready to capture its water. He's got the water supply captured, and then he sends a message back to David. Hey, come with the rest of the army and get credit for this. Otherwise, I'll capture it and then I'll get credit for the victory. So he had some humility there and recognized David as king. So that was kind of neat. I just kind of looking at Joab differently than when I first was reading about him. And I hadn't in my past readings of the Bible, I've never thought a whole lot about Joab at all. But at first I thought, yeah, this guy's kind of a little bit of a creep. And he earns his way into as a captain of the army. See, Joab was originally not talked about as like one of the 3 or one of the 30 of the most recognized warriors of David's army, but he ended up capturing a city and becoming the chief of his chief commander of the army. And now he's saying, "Hey, David, come take credit for this," you know. So he does good there. And then we get to see a little later about Joab restoring David's family to him. But realize that we know that David's going to suffer with his family fighting and dying and bloodshed being had over with David's family amongst themselves, because that's what God said would happen for his sin with Bathsheba. So we know that's happening. Then this next part that was Chronicles and 1 Chronicles 22 and chapter 20 verses 2 and 3 kind of repeats the part with Joab there. Then we get into 2 Samuel 13 and we get the whole how do we put that? We see the birth of sin. We see how sin can start and grow. We get we get Amnon, one of David's sons, pining for his sister Tamar, and it starts out that he finds her attractive, and it grows to obsession with her. It grows into obsession, and then his obsession grew till he became ill and he couldn't do anything else. And then he had friends surround him that showed him how to obtain that. And then he uses trickery to obtain his desire in sin. And as soon as he partakes of that sin, it's turned on him into hatred. That love and that obsession gets turned into hatred when he finally partakes and has of it. And that's how the devil works. That's how sin works, and that's something we need to be very cautious of and be very aware of it. If something is starting to take hold of us, we need to repent right away and run from it and seek God and find something that'll replace that. And God's the only thing that can, in his word. So we did see this coming. It's rough that we see it happen like this. And then we get Absalom's revenge on Amnon, which I'm not saying is wrong. By today's standards, with today's justice, it would be, but in this case, it was what it was. So Absalom makes a deal, tricks the king into letting Amnon come, and then Absalom kills Amnon for raping his sister. So that does happen. And yeah, and then David, rightly or wrongly, that's to be determined, but basically banishes Absalom. But Joab, again, this is where Joab steps in and tricks David into realizing that this banning of Absalom and this hatred towards Absalom isn't doing anybody any good, that he needs to reconcile. So he brings Absalom back but won't meet with him. And finally, Absalom says, tries to get with Joab. Joab's kind of refusing. And finally, he has to burn Joab's field to get him to recognize that there's a need there. And then Joab goes to the king on his behalf. Interesting how those things play out, and should they have gone to that? I guess that's a question. Should that have needed to take place in that way? And what can we learn about it? What does that tell us about how we are? And I think there's places where we get caught in ourselves and get self-righteous about things, where we don't act the way that we should, and we don't humble ourselves. I think humility is the biggest importance here. I know where it says we should not think of ourselves more important than we ought. We should humble ourselves. Today's message in church, for our church, our pastor talked about humility and how he's been humbled, and how being humbled has grown him and fed him. And it's through that shame and through that humility. But in this, we see where David was very humble and gave God credit for so much. And that's one of the things that I saw in Joab, that he humbled himself and gave David credit. He gave God credit in a lot of different ways in battles in the verses before this. That humility is where God can work in us and through us and for us. It's our humility. It's knowing that it's God that does everything, that God does our work. It's knowing that through him we can do so much. We can be more than conquerors. But if it's on our own accord, we're bound to fail, and we're bound to flounder, and we're bound to have problems. So that's what I get today out of reading, and between today's reading and the message in church this morning, and what I've been reading about David, what I see about David is his humility is what gets him great. It's his knowing that he has to rely on God. That is what where he has victory. And when he turns and he doesn't have that total reliance on God, I'm not seeing that in him in this last reading. It doesn't talk a lot about David going to God and giving God credit. Although, we'll see that in the Psalms, and I think the Psalms are where he records the times where he has given God credit. And that's where we need to be, is totally reliant on God and be giving God credit for all things, and just leaning on that. So very important.